The old man did not ask for anything. That was the first thing Sadie noticed. Not the cello case slung over his shoulder, damp and battered as a shipwrecked trunk, and not the careful way he held himself in the doorway like a man deciding whether a place was worth the trouble of entering. What she noticed was the not asking. He stood there in the grey October rain and looked at the pastry case and then looked away, and his jaw was set with the particular stubbornness of someone who had decided a long time ago that wanting things publicly was a kind of weakness he could not afford. The bakery was called Oram's. It had always been called Oram's even before Sadie was born, because her grandmother Pearl had put the sign up herself in the summer of 1977 with a brush and a tin of marine blue paint, and no one had seen fit to change it since. The sign still read the same, though the paint had gone soft at the edges, and the O had a crack in it that let the rain in every November, and Sadie had been meaning to fix it for 2 years. She had been meaning to do a great many things for 2 years, which was how long it had been since Pearl died, and left her the bakery and everything that came with it, including the mortgage Pearl had never once mentioned, and the shoebox under the counter full of invoices. Sadie was learning to recognize the way you learn to recognize a headache, slowly, and with dread. It was the middle of October. The summer tourists were gone, and the harbour was quiet in the way that a town is quiet when the people who actually live in it are left alone together. Sadie had cleared $230 that week. She knew because she had counted it 3 times, the way a person counts things when the counting is not really about the number. She put down the cloth she'd been using on the counter and said, "Come in then, you're letting the cold in." He came in. His name, he told her when she asked, and she asked because she always asked, because Pearl had taught her that a person's name in your mouth is the smallest courtesy you can offer them, was Arthur Fell. "Just Arthur," he said, with the mild firmness of a man who expected the surname to land and was tired of watching it do so. It didn't land on Sadie, which seemed to surprise him. She had grown up on the East Coast and knew almost nothing about the Toronto music world. And this, she realized later, was probably the first honest rest he'd had in years. "Kitchen's running," she said. "I've got a roll left and I made too much chowder. I always make too much chowder on a Thursday. It's a character flaw." She was already moving toward the back. "Sit down. That stool by the window, the cushion doesn't slip." He said, "I haven't got any money with me." And she said, "I noticed." He sat down. She had not, in fact, noticed. She'd assumed he had money the way she assumed everyone had money until proven otherwise. But she understood, in the way that came from watching her grandmother manage this room for 3 decades before her, that a man who announces he can't pay before you've offered him anything is not a man without pride. He is a man with enormous pride and a very small safety net, and what he needs is to be treated as though neither of those things are remarkable. So she made no adjustment. She brought him the roll and the chowder and a cup of tea she had not been asked for. And she went back behind the counter and began to wipe down the same stretch of counter she had already wiped twice, and she did not watch him eat. He ate slowly. She had expected him to fall on it. She had made the mistake of that assumption before, with people who came in from the rain with that particular look. But he didn't. He broke the roll in half first. He used the spoon properly. He set it down between bites, and she understood, without knowing quite how she understood it, that the slowness was not the slowness of a man savoring food. It was the slowness of a man reminding himself and reminding the room that he had once sat at very good tables. When he was done, he pressed a paper napkin flat and set it square on the empty bowl, and he looked at Sadie across the counter with a pair of pale, sharp eyes that had clearly spent a very long time looking at things carefully. "You play," he said, nodding at the old upright piano along the east wall. It had belonged to Pearl, who had played it on winter evenings when the last customer was gone, never for an audience, only for the room. "Not well," Sadie said. "It was my grandmother's." "May I?" She said yes. She didn't know why she said it. She had never once in 2 years let anyone touch that piano. He sat down on the bench and adjusted it and placed his hands on the keys, and then he did not play. He was still for a moment that went on longer than stillness usually goes, and Sadie held her breath without meaning to. Then he played a single phrase, 8 or 9 notes, quiet enough that she had to stop the coffee pot from rattling to hear it. It was the kind of thing that sounds simple and is not. It sounded, Sadie thought, exactly like the harbour looked on a morning when the fog hadn't lifted yet. Not sad, exactly, but full of a feeling for which she did not have the English. He lifted his hands. "That's a good instrument," he said. "Whoever kept it well." He came back the next day and the day after that. By the third day, she had stopped pretending the extra chowder was an accident. She made it on purpose now and told herself it was only sense that it would go to waste otherwise. And she was aware that this was exactly the kind of elaborate untruth that she would not have gotten away with in front of Pearl, who had a gift for identifying the precise moment a person started lying to themselves. Pearl would have laughed. Pearl would have told her to own the kindness instead of dressing it up in practicality, because kindness dressed as practicality fools no one and satisfies no one, and is really just cowardice with better manners. On the fourth day, Arthur brought a notebook. He sat at the window stool after he ate, and he wrote in it with a pencil, quickly and without hesitation, the way a person writes when the thing being written has been in their head a long time already. When he left, she saw that he had torn one page free and set it on the stool, held down by the sugar shaker. It was music notation, a full staff of it, a phrase that resolved itself into something that felt, even to someone who couldn't read music properly, like a held breath let go. At the bottom, in handwriting that had once been taught carefully and had since gotten impatient with itself, he had written, "For Orams. To be played only on Thursdays." She put it on the piano. She did not know, standing there in her grandmother's bakery with flour still on her left wrist, that the single bowl of chowder she had slid across that counter 4 days ago would cost her the manageable morning half-life she had built inside this place, and deliver her something she had not once in her life had the nerve to want. But that came later. First, there was the October rain, and an old man who played 8 notes as though he had been waiting 45 years to play them in exactly that room. The trouble arrived on a Wednesday, wearing expensive shoes and a Bluetooth earpiece that he never once used but never took out either, as though it were a signal rather than a tool. His name was Brett Harlow. He was with a development company out of Halifax, and he set a glossy folder on her counter, the way people set things down when they want you to know the thing is expensive. He wanted to buy the building next door, the one Pearl had used as a storage room and workshop for 30 years, and that now sat empty, attached to the bakery by a shared wall and a doorway Sadie had nailed shut when pipes froze 2 winters back. The workshop sat on a corner lot that faced the harbour directly. It was not by any measure a large piece of land. It was, by Brett Harlow's reckoning, the last piece of harbour frontage in Prospect Harbour, not already signed over to the development consortium that had spent the past 4 years buying up the waterfront property one lot at a time. The number we're putting forward reflects current market conditions. He tapped the folder. Given the state of the building and the outstanding amount on your grandmother's commercial mortgage, which I understand has been in arrears. I know what it's in arrears for, Sadie said. Of course. Then you'll appreciate that this is a generous offer, given that in 18 months the bank's patience on a property like this will be. The building isn't for sale. Harlow smiled at her, the way people smile when they have already decided the other person will change their mind and are simply waiting for the correct combination of pressure to achieve it. He left the folder. He left the card. He left with the unhurried ease of a man who believed time was working in his favor. Sadie stood very still after the door closed and looked at the folder without opening it, and thought about the number in her grandmother's mortgage documents and the number in the shoebox. She thought about the piano. She thought about the harbour fog. She didn't open the folder. Arthur came that afternoon. His eyes moved over the glossy folder on the counter and then away, and Sadie said simply, "Development company." Arthur nodded as though this were information he had been expecting. He ate. He wrote in his notebook. When he stood to go, he reached into the breast pocket of his coat and took out a small envelope, pale cream, soft at the corners from being carried a while, and set it on the windowsill. "I'm going to be away for a bit," he said. "My daughter is in Lyon. There's a heart thing. Nothing dramatic," he added, with the tone of a man for whom dramatic was a category reserved for music and not for himself. "But I've been putting off the trip and I've run out of reasons." "Come back before the season changes," Sadie said. She meant it as a simple thing. It came out as something more, and they both heard the difference, and neither of them acknowledged it, which seemed to be the right answer. He went. She did not see which way he walked. She found the envelope when she was closing up. Inside it was a key, small, old, very specifically made for one door and no other, with a length of faded blue ribbon tied through the bow. Underneath it on the inside flap of the envelope, in the handwriting she now knew, "The building on Cress Lane, north-facing second gate. You'll know the door." She stood in her grandmother's bakery with the key in her palm and no idea what it opened. She put it in her apron pocket, told herself she would give it back when he returned, and went to turn off the lights. He did not return the next day or the next week. The woman who came instead arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in a car, the color of old pewter, and she moved up the bakery steps with the particular economy of motion of someone who does not consider any entrance to be beneath her. She was 70 perhaps, with white hair and a slim briefcase, and she introduced herself as Ms. Millicent Good, solicitor, representing the estate and affairs of one Arthur Fell. Sadie heard the past tense implied in estate before Ms. Good said anything else, and her hand tightened on the counter edge. "He's fine," Ms. Good said, reading her with the ease of a woman who had delivered difficult news in many rooms. "He is in Lyon with his daughter, and will, knowing him, irritate the cardiology staff comprehensively before making a full recovery." I said the same thing about the procedure at 70 and was correct. Something moved at the edge of her mouth that was not quite a smile but was related to one. "What I have for you is not bad news, Miss Oram. It is simply a great deal of it." She opened the briefcase. She placed a folder on the counter, heavier, much heavier than Harlow's had been. 3 days ago, Ms. Good said, Mr. Fell executed a transfer of title. It is complete. It is registered with the municipality. The property in question is the Fell residence on Cress Lane. The house, the grounds, the stone outbuilding and the attached wharf. Last appraised at 1.3 million. She paused with the timing of a woman who understood that sums need a moment of silence around them. "It is yours, Miss Oram, as of this week. There is nothing to sign. I'm here to give you the documents and this." From the briefcase she produced a sealed envelope, Sadie's name on the front in Arthur's impatient hand. "People don't do this," Sadie said. "Most people," Ms. Good agreed. "He asked me to tell you the number first. He was very particular about that. He said you should know you weren't dreaming before you read anything he'd written." Sadie opened the envelope. The letter was short. "Sadie, by now Millicent has told you the number and you've argued with it in your head. Stop. I've been in that bakery 4 times and I know what's in your shoebox. I also know what's in mine, and it has been there for 45 years, which is long enough. There is a room in the stone outbuilding at the end of the garden walk. The key on the ribbon is for that room. No one has seen the inside of it but me. I would like you to be the one who opens it first, before Tate, before anyone. You'll understand why when you do. You fed a man who told you he hadn't any money. You did it 4 days running. You let him play your grandmother's piano and didn't ask why he needed to. That is not a small thing, though I know you think it is. Use the house or sell it. I have one request, which is not a condition. There is a piano in the front room that was played by someone I was not allowed to keep. If you can play it on Thursdays, I would be grateful. A. Fell. Sadie read it twice. The second time her eyes caught on someone I was not allowed to keep, and she couldn't move past it. Miss Good was quiet. Outside, a gull knocked against the windowsill and righted itself and flew. "His grandson," Miss Good said at last. "Tate. He manages the Fell Foundation, the arts charity based in Halifax. He doesn't know yet. I informed him this morning and I'll be honest with you. He was not glad." She clicked the briefcase shut. "He will come. He is not a man who sends people where he can go himself. A gift of this size, made by a man who has recently required cardiac surgery, to a woman he met 4 weeks ago over a bowl of chowder, will not look." "I know how it looks," Sadie said. "Yes." Miss Good studied her. "I believe you do, which is why I'll tell you this. Don't go to the house alone before he arrives, not because of anything to do with Tate. He's difficult, not dangerous. But whatever is in that outbuilding, Arthur wanted it seen for the first time with some understanding of what it means. And you don't have that yet." She set a card on the counter. "When the grandson comes, offer him tea. They never expect tea. It makes them feel they've walked into the wrong room." She was gone before Sadie found anything to say. Tate Fell came the following afternoon in a truck that had no business being as clean as it was on Nova Scotia roads in October, and he walked into Oram's the way someone walks into a room. They've already decided they've lost and want to understand why. He was younger than she'd braced for. Early 30s, dark hair, dressed the way people from the city dress when they're trying to look like they're not from the city. He had his grandfather's eyes, the same watchful grey. He sat down without being asked. "I'll be straightforward," he said. "I've driven 3 hours and I have a board meeting tomorrow and I'd rather not." "Tea?" Sadie said. He stopped. "I've got it on," she said. "It's no trouble." He recalibrated, the way people recalibrate when the room is not the room they prepared for. "Fine, Thank you. She made the tea and set it in front of him, and sat down across the counter on her grandmother's stool, and waited. The foundation is not in good shape, he said. It hasn't been for a long time. My grandfather knows this. He built it and he's been refusing for 12 years to let me restructure it because that would mean closing 2 programs he started in the 80s. Programs that haven't had a viable applicant in 6 years. Programs that exist because he won't face the fact that the world he designed them for isn't there anymore. He turned the mug in his hands. The Cress Lane property is the only remaining asset we could realize to bridge the gap. I had a buyer lined up. We were 3 weeks from signing. He looked at her directly. And then my grandfather went to a bakery in Prospect Harbour and gave the property to the woman behind the counter. He didn't go to a bakery, Sadie said quietly. He came in from the rain. Tate looked at her. He stood in the doorway, she said, and he looked at the pastry case and then looked away, and I could see he hadn't eaten properly in a couple of days, so I made him chowder. That's the whole of it. And the 4 subsequent visits. He played the piano. He asked first. There's a difference. Something moved in Tate's face. A small rearrangement like furniture shifted an inch in a familiar room. Then it settled. I need that property, he said. There are 11 staff whose positions depend on the foundation remaining solvent. I'm not asking you to give up something you've earned. I'm asking you to consider a fair. What was he not allowed to keep? Sadie asked. He went still. In his letter, she said, he mentioned someone, a person he wasn't allowed to keep. Who was that? Tate put the mug down. I don't know. The quiet stretched between them long enough that she believed him. Come with me to the house, she said. There's a room I'm supposed to open. He was specific about the order. Me first, then everyone else. But I think you should be there. Whatever's in it, it involves your family. She should have listened to Ms. Good and waited until morning. But Sadie Oram had spent 2 years being careful, and careful had gotten her a shoebox full of debt and a bakery 4 months from the bank's patience running out. She had the key on her apron string and October light still left in the sky. So she closed up an hour early, and they drove to Cress Lane in separate vehicles. Because she was not quite ready to share a car with a man she'd met 40 minutes ago, even if his eyes were the same eyes she'd been handing chowder to all month. The house on Cress Lane was pale stone and harbour-facing, older than anything on the street around it. The garden at the back ran to a low stone outbuilding half covered in old vine, and beyond it the wharf, and beyond the wharf the Atlantic going silver in the last light. The building at the end of the garden had a single door, green painted, and a lock that the key on the blue ribbon fit exactly. The smell came first, rosin and cold stone and something old and papery, the way a library smells when no one has opened the windows in a decade. Then the room itself, a practice space, bare floor music stands, a small wood stove, and along the far wall, running floor to the low rafters mounted in simple frames, pages of handwritten musical manuscript, dozens of them, scores after scores filled with a handwriting she recognized. At the top of each page a name written in pencil. She moved closer. Pearl, they all said. For Pearl, some with a date, some without. The earliest she could find was 1979, the most recent this past spring. Sadie put her hand against the wall and held on. She knew that name on the wall was her grandmother's name. She knew the handwriting at the bottom of each page was Arthur's. The same impatient slant from the notebook from the envelope, and she knew what it meant to see Pearl's name repeated in someone else's hand 40, 50, 60 times across 45 years of manuscript pages. She knew what kind of keeping that was. That's my grandmother, she said. Her voice came out flat and strange. He wrote all of this. There was a woman in the corner of the room. She was old, 80 at least, small and round-shouldered in a fisherman's sweater, with white hair pinned up and bright dark eyes that had been watching them both since they arrived. She had clearly decided to wait until someone said something worth responding to. Mabel Cray, the woman said. I've looked after this house 38 years. Arthur called me from the hospital in Lyon. Reversed the charges. She said this with the exasperation of someone who expects this behavior and has given up being surprised by it. He said a woman named Sadie was going to come. He said she'd come with the grandson even though he'd told her to come alone, because telling her to come alone was the reliable way to make sure she'd bring company. Her dark eyes moved to Tate. He knows his grandson. Tate said nothing. He was looking at the wall of manuscripts with an expression Sadie could not name. Something past surprise. Something that looked like the beginning of a question he wasn't sure he wanted answered. She wrote to him, Mabel said, coming into the center of the room. Your grandmother, Miss Oram. Right up until the year she died. Not often, once or twice a year. She wrote him about the bakery. She wrote him when she hired her first employee and when she paid off the oven. She wrote him once about a granddaughter who'd come to stay one summer and baked her first loaf and cried when it came out right. Mabel's voice went quiet, and he kept everyone. Sadie pressed her hand harder against the wall. They met in Halifax, Mabel said, when they were both 22. She was playing piano at a hotel on weekends to pay rent. He was already being called gifted by people who considered themselves judges of it. They were together nearly 2 years. And then his family found out, and did what families do when they find out a son intends to marry a fisherman's daughter with nothing behind her but a good ear and a good heart. She paused. They called in a loan. Her father had a boat and a processing shed and a note at the bank, and the bank the Fells sat on the board of called that note in all at once, and the boat went, and the shed went, and the family scattered up the coast looking for work. Arthur was told clearly what would happen to Pearl's people if he made any more trouble. So he married the woman his family chose, and Pearl came home and built herself a bakery, because she had decided that she would build something of her own that no one could ever call in. Sadie was crying. She hadn't decided to. She became aware of it the way you become aware of rain. He came to Oram's, she said, to see it. He came to see the thing she built. He came because his doctors told him to slow down, and the one thing he wanted before he slowed down was to see it in person. Mabel's voice caught briefly and was flat again. He walked in and found you. You have her hands, apparently, and her way of not asking a person to justify the hunger before you address it. Tate made a sound in his throat. He had not moved from the wall. He was looking at the oldest pages, the ones dated 1979. He played some of this, he said very quietly. When I was a boy, I would hear it through the door and I thought he was composing. I didn't know. He turned around, and his face was undone in the way faces are undone, by information that reorganizes the past rather than the present. My grandmother sat at the end of the dinner table for 30 years, and they never. He stopped. I grew up thinking we were simply a cold family. I thought that was just what we were. No one said anything for a while. Outside, the Atlantic moved against the wharf in slow dark surges, and the October air came under the door smelling of brine and long distances. Mabel crossed to the far end of the room and lifted something from a low wooden chest. A flat portfolio case latched with a small padlock through the clasp, a bright new lock recently fitted. She held it out towards Sadie with both hands. He was particular, Mabel said. The key on the ribbon opens this too. The door and the case, same key. He said you'd know what to do once you saw what was inside. Sadie fitted the key. The portfolio held 3 things. The first was a letter addressed to her. Near the end, it said, "You fed a stranger the way she would have fed a stranger. I don't know if that's coincidence. I have been alive long enough to believe it isn't." The second was a bound legal document with a municipal stamp on the cover page. Tate took it when she passed it across and read it in silence. "Heritage designation," he said when he looked up. His voice had changed. The property, the house, the outbuilding, the wharf, all of it. He registered it as a provincially recognized heritage site 6 weeks ago. The character of the buildings and the wharf are protected in perpetuity. He set the document down slowly. It can't be developed. It can't be rezoned. It can't be sold to Harlow's consortium or anyone like them. He exhaled something that was not quite a laugh. He tied the land up before he gave it to you. Harlow's been positioning for this lot for 2 years, and Arthur made it legally worthless to him 6 weeks ago, before he ever walked into your bakery. The third document Sadie understood without any legal training, because it was written in plain language, and the numbers in it were large and unambiguous. Arthur had placed his entire archive, 45 years of composition, under a charitable trust, with the Fell Foundation named as beneficiary. The condition of the bequest was that the works would be shown properly, publicly, as a complete body. The full story told, no omissions. The estimated value of the rights was not a number Sadie had ever had occasion to say out loud before. Tate stood very still. "That's the foundation," he said quietly. "That's 11 positions. That's 10 years of programming without cutting a single thing." He looked at the wall of manuscripts, and this is what he was composing all this time. I catalogued the archive 3 years ago, and he told me those rooms held unfinished studies and academic exercises. He said it wasn't ready to be seen. He put a hand over his mouth and then lowered it. He was keeping it until someone could tell the true story of it. Not the version where he was simply a great man with a private practice. The version where he was a young man in love, and his family destroyed her, and he spent 45 years trying to give something back through the only door left open to him. "You need someone to manage the archive," Sadie said. "The exhibition, the licensing, the foundation's claim to the estate, while the heritage designation holds everything in trust." Tate looked at her. "I need to keep my bakery," she said. "I can't run an estate on top of it alone. Pearl couldn't keep everything. She lost the music and she built the bread. I am not going to be the one who loses the bread to get the music." She met his eyes. "But I'm also not going to hand this wall to anyone who'll make it smaller than it is." Tate was quiet long enough that she heard the Atlantic again. Then he said, "He told me once, when I was about 9, that the truest thing he'd ever composed was something he hadn't finished. I asked him when he'd know the ending. He looked at the wall. He said he was waiting for the right room." "Then you should know this room," Sadie said, "before anyone else does, so you can tell it right." She did not reach for him. She simply stood in the low light of the outbuilding, with her grandmother's name surrounding them on every wall, and let the offer sit between them plain and without condition. Mabel, from her post by the chest, said, "There's a kettle in the house, and it's cold in here, and I'm 81. So if the two of you are going to keep standing there making important decisions at each other, could you please do it somewhere with central heating?" They did. They locked the outbuilding and walked back through the garden to the house, and Mabel made tea in a kitchen that smelled of cedar and old wood, and they sat around a table that had held 4 generations of a family's difficult silences, and they talked until the harbour lights came on below the garden wall. Brett Harlow came in person on Friday, with a different smile and the same earpiece, and a counter-offer that reflected, he said, the new information about the heritage status. It was a smaller number this time. The smile suggested this was Sadie's fault. She thanked him for his time. She put a bag of shortbread in his hands for the drive, because Pearl had always sent people away with something to hold, and she stood in the doorway and watched his clean truck disappear around the bend. She did not feel triumphant. She felt tired and grateful, which she had come to understand was what real things felt like, as opposed to imagined ones. The exhibition opened the following spring in Halifax, in a gallery space that had been partially funded by the first licensing agreement for 3 pieces from the archive. They called it simply Pearl, her name on a white banner across the building's face, restored to the world that had let her leave it without record, without acknowledgement, without the single public page she deserved. People came from across the country. A reviewer from a national paper called the collection the most significant rediscovery in Canadian musical history in a generation, and noted, in passing, the extraordinary circumstance of its provenance: a bowl of chowder, a rainy Thursday, a door that happened to be unlocked. Sadie read that line in the bakery on a Wednesday morning and folded the paper and put it under the counter next to the shoebox, which no longer had unpaid invoices in it. Arthur wrote from Lyon, "I am told the exhibition has exceeded projections, whatever that means. Millicent sounds pleased, which is a thing I have not heard in 30 years. I have started a new piece. The French bread is good, but I find I miss the chowder." She wrote back on the back of a receipt, "Chowder's on whenever you're back. The O in the sign is fixed." Tate came on Thursdays. He said it was because Halifax was 3 hours away, and Thursday was the logical midpoint of the week for the meetings that had proliferated since the archive went public. This was true as far as it went. He brought the file folders and worked through the administrative questions that came with managing something that had gotten, very suddenly, much larger than expected. And sometimes they talked about the archive, and sometimes they talked about other things, and sometimes they said nothing at all, and the old piano along the east wall held the room between them like a third party, patient, unhurried, waiting for someone to remember it was there. He was not fast about any of it. He had told her from the beginning that he wasn't, and she respected this more than she would have respected speed. He had spent 30 years learning to be careful, and he was unlearning it slowly, the way a person unlearns a habit that kept them safe for a long time, with full awareness of what it costs to put down, and without apology for how long the putting down takes. She did not push. She had Pearl's counter and Pearl's patience, and a bakery full of people she was learning to love without condition, which was the only kind of love that had ever held against November. Arthur came back in May. He walked in on a Thursday. Of course it was a Thursday, thinner than before and slower on the stairs, and he sat down on the stool that didn't slip and ordered chowder in the tone of a man who expects to have to justify himself. Sadie had the bowl on the counter before he finished asking. He looked at it, and then at her, and then at the old upright piano along the east wall, on top of which she had framed the manuscript page he'd left behind in October, the one marked for Orams, to be played only on Thursdays. "You framed it," he said. "My grandmother would have framed it," Sadie said. "I'm not going to be less than her about it." He made a sound that might have been a laugh, and might have been something that decided, at the last moment, to be quieter. He ate his chowder. He set his spoon down between bites with the care of a man who had once sat at very good tables and now understood, perhaps better than before, that the table in front of him was also, in its own way, a very good one. Outside the window the harbour was running silver and the lobster boats were already out, and the O in the sign was whole. Sadie kept the bakery open. That was the first thing and the most important thing, and she did not let anyone talk her out of it. Not the foundation board members who suggested she might consider consolidating. Not the well-meaning friends who asked whether she might want a quieter life now. Not the part of herself that had sometimes, in the darkest months, wondered whether a quieter life might simply mean a smaller grief. She kept Oram's open because Pearl had put the sign up herself in 1977 with a brush and a tin of marine blue paint, and because the O was fixed now, and because on Thursday afternoons there was usually music in the room, and on Thursday evenings there was usually a man at the window stool who was learning, against considerable previous training, to sit still without accounting for the time. They married the following autumn in the garden at Cress Lane, among the roses Pearl had never once seen, and that Arthur had planted the summer she wrote him about them in a letter, planted them from her description the way a man furnishes a room he is not allowed to enter. The wharf was strung with lights. The Atlantic was calm and flat all the way to the horizon, as though it had been asked politely. Mabel stood up beside them in a fisherman's sweater, the colour of heather, dry-eyed and glaring at anyone who wept, which was everyone. Arthur sat in the front row with his cello case between his feet and played the phrase he had first played in Oram's bakery on a grey Thursday in October, the 8 notes that sounded like harbour fog lifting, and the assembled guests went very quiet in the way people go quiet when a room suddenly contains more than the people standing in it. There was of course food, a great deal of food. Sadie made most of it herself because that was the one reckless, generous thing no one had ever managed to talk her out of. She stood at the long table under the late afternoon light and watched the people she'd made and understood, completely and without surprise, that this, not the house, not the heritage designation, not the archive, not the exhibition, was the whole of it. It had always been the bread. She kept Oram's open 3 days a week, even after there was no earthly financial need. She kept it because Pearl had put up the sign herself, and because you do not close a door that someone spent a lifetime holding open. When a stranger came in at the grey end of the afternoon and looked at the pastry case and then looked away, ashamed of the looking, Sadie would have the kettle on before they'd finished deciding whether to ask. She would say the shortbread was going to go stale otherwise, which was rarely true, and she had learned it from her grandmother, who had learned it from the particular understanding of women who know that the people most in need of care are most likely to refuse it if you call it what it is. The rest of it, the stone house, the harbour view, the man who had finally learned to leave his truck unlocked because there was now somewhere he was always going to come back to, had all begun in exactly the same place. A bowl of chowder set down without condition. A door that happened to be unlocked on a rainy Thursday in October. The smallest, most ordinary courage in the world, which turns out, when you look closely, not to be small at all.